Okay, let's go ahead and get started. Thanks everyone for joining us today. My name is Angel Shu, Assistant Professor of Public Policy and Environment here at UNC Chapel Hill, and also the Director and Founder of the Data-Driven EnviroLab. We seek to apply quantitative, data-driven approaches to environmental policy questions. And today we are so delighted to introduce Mook Bangalore, who is finishing up his PhD at the London School of Economics in the Department of Geography and Environment and the Grantham Research Institute. His work focuses on sustainable development challenges across the global South. And prior to your PhD, you were based at World Bank, working in the Office of Chief Economist, got some really wonderful publications looking at this intersection of development economics and environment. And so, and then also just found out that he recently accepted a position at Penn State in the Department of Public Policy. So we're so delighted that you could make it. And so I'll just turn it to you. Thank you so much for joining.
No, yeah, thanks for the introduction and for the invitation. I'm following Angel's footsteps by working in policy first and then go to academia. But today I'll be talking about a paper looking at the impacts of floods in Nigeria. And feel free to get some treats. Sorry for the online participants who won't be able to enjoy the cookies, but hopefully it'll be okay. So just before I start about the paper, I'll just talk a little bit about my PhD. And I look at how households relate to environmental challenges when it comes to sustainable development. And we have all these global goals when it comes to promoting living standards and environmental well-being at the global international scale. We have a lot less work on the local level impacts of, say, food security impacts across the global South. So part of my PhD wanted to look at sort of how can we learn more about what happens at the local level when it comes to all these sustainable development challenges that we face. So my PhD tries to link to these sustainable development goals. And some of the papers look at things like poverty, others look at things like gender equality and life on land and tree cover loss. And I work in Vietnam, Indonesia, and across the global South. And today we'll be talking about this paper over here on the impacts of floods in Nigeria in 2012. So the research question that I really want to look at here was, how do floods impact people's lives at the local level across the global South? And there's a couple of reasons why I think this is important. The first one is on exposure. So a lot of times in rich countries, people tend to have better housing stock. So they tend to be less exposed to floods compared to a developing country context where you have lots of households living close to the river or close to water, and they tend to live in pretty structures that are pretty vulnerable to floods. The second reason is vulnerability, and this has to do with impacts. And for a lot of us, here in the US, we tend to have our assets or our savings in a bank account. And if a flood occurs, I'm not likely to lose all the millions of dollars that are in my bank account as a grad student. But if a lot of my assets or my wealth is held in physical form, these types of assets are more vulnerable to shocks like floods. So that's another reason why it's really important to look at impacts across the global South. And the other reason is there's also less of ability to respond. There's different things that people can do to try to smooth the impacts of shocks, like insurance or social protection schemes or aid from the government. But these tend to be a lot less sort of prevalent for poor people, and they have less access to these after a disaster happens. So for these reasons, we tend to have a lot more severe impacts of floods specifically in developing country contexts. And even just this past year in 2022, there was a lot of coverage about floods in West Africa and in Pakistan, which were the worst that were seen in many, many years and have tremendously devastating impacts. So this is really happening all the time. And this image here looks at all the flood events over the past 30 or 40 years. And I think that it's really important to note that floods are pretty much distributed across the globe, but a lot of the work is mostly on the US or Western Europe. There's a lot less work on Africa or South America or even Southeast Asia, despite the fact that these floods are happening all the time. And another stat that I just want to put out there is this shows the sort of share of economic losses from natural disasters last year. And Africa, based on this figure, has about 0 to 1% of the total economic losses from natural disasters. And for me, this doesn't really sort of make a lot of intuitive sense because there's lots of impacts happening. You read all these impacts in the news articles and you learn about them. But the way we measure economic losses is you take sort of all the buildings or all the infrastructure that is hit by a flood, you take the monetary value, and then you come up with a number. And there's a lot less sort of infrastructure in developing countries. So for that reason, their numbers are, necessarily lower. But that doesn't mean that the impacts are any sort of less. They might, in fact, be a lot worse. So that's really the focus why I want to study this context. And I'll talk about this event specifically. So I'm studying the impact of an event in 2012 in Nigeria, which was the worst flood in about 40 years. And at the time that this was happening, typically what happens is there is some sort of agency which comes out with a report which tallies all the economic losses from an event. And I was working at the World Bank at this time, and this report was produced, which was sort of a post-disaster needs assessment, where they go to the country, they tally up all the sectors and all the areas that have losses, and they create some sort of figure about the value of the damage for this event. And this comes up to about $17 billion. And sort of just to link back to the previous slide, I found this to be helpful, having a number to understand the scale of the impact, but it really doesn't reflect the impacts on the poorest. So the spirit behind this paper is to look more detail at the local level impacts of the specific flood. And the whole idea is that if we better understand the local impacts, we can better design policy moving forward. I'm also happy to take questions throughout the presentation. Just feel free to raise your hand and interrupt. So the way that I do this is I take a bunch of household survey data and I link it with satellite images to understand what the impact of this flood was on households. And this is something that I typically do is I give an overview of the paper, and these are the main results. So I found that farmers lost about 20% of their production and about 40% of their revenue in terms of their agricultural losses. But I think that because it's a local case study, I can tease out some more things that are going on here. So I find that households who live in a flood area, but they themselves weren't affected, actually benefit from the flood because they're able to sort of use higher food prices at the local level and sort of gain a bit more from that. And these are sort of dynamics that aren't really captured a lot in a lot of case studies when it comes to natural disasters. But in this study, I think is an important thing to consider. And I also look at whether or not households who typically don't experience floods, but were hit in 2012, do they have any different impacts from those households who, for example, had floods almost throughout their lifetime, so maybe more adapted to floods. And I do find that households who don't typically are exposed to floods do have more severe impacts when it comes to this event. I also look at consumption changes. So consumption changes more at looking at, do people spend less money after the flood? And I don't really find much difference in households that are affected, but I do find about a 5% drop in food consumption the year after for urban households specifically. So these are basically the main findings of the paper. And I'll give a bit more context about floods in Nigeria specifically. They're the most common weather-related disaster in the country, and the share of households who are experiencing floods is rising with climate change. In 2012, there were warnings provided about 6 months in advance that this year was going to be particularly severe from the National Meteorological Agency, but unfortunately nothing was done to prepare for this event. And there was extreme rainfall from July to November, There was over 400 fatalities, 2 million people were displaced, and there was a lot of agricultural impacts across the country. So there's 3 research questions that I'll sort of go through in turn. The first one looks at what were the direct and the indirect impacts of these floods on agricultural households. The second research question looks at this sort of ability for households to adapt, and looks at if households were outside of a historical flood zone, are they more likely to be flooded or sort of experience severe impacts. And then I also look at consumption changes and see if it's different for urban versus rural households. There's a lot of literature that I could go through, but I guess I'll just look at 3 main messages. There's a lot of research when it comes to natural disaster impacts, but most of it tends to look at sort of what's the impact of cyclones or hurricanes or floods on things like country level GDP or state level GDP. And there's a lot of these studies mostly sort of in the global north. But we do find that from the studies that have been done on the global south, that natural disasters do have a big impact on economic growth in developing countries. And mostly, this is something that is helpful to learn from a broader context. The second message that I think is also pretty important as part of the spirit of this paper is that local details really matters. So it matters who's affected by a flood or a cyclone. It matters what types of economic activity are being done in these areas. What are the linkages between households and markets? And a lot of these sort of local details aren't always captured in these country level or state level analyses. So that's why I was trying to get further, to the source to more look at household level impacts. And then the third message is that over the last 10 or 15 years, we've been able to get a lot more precise information on where people live in these surveys. So we have information on their socioeconomic characteristics over time, and we kind of know where they live. So we can link that GPS information with satellite images or information on floods, and that allows us to really be able to do an analysis like this. And there's a few papers that are in the literature. There's a couple on sub-Saharan Africa, one in Malawi, one in Tanzania, that find that floods do reduce crop production by about 30%. There's one paper in Guatemala who finds that food consumption does decrease after a tropical storm. That was Tropical Storm Agatha. And when it comes to this specific event itself, there is some work in the literature on this, but mostly on the sort of political and socioeconomic factors that shape vulnerability across the country. And there's a couple of contributions of this paper. One is that I look at local impacts of floods using both satellite data and also survey data. I look at both agricultural and consumption outcomes for households, and I'm able to identify some of the direct and indirect effects when it comes to spillovers. But first, I'll talk a little bit about the household survey data itself. This is called the Living Standards Measurement Survey, the LSMS. Some of y'all might have used this before. And it's a very long 60 to 100 page household survey where people will go to individual households and ask them a bunch of questions, say over the course of an hour or so. And the reason the study was possible is that they had already done a couple of surveys before the flood, and it's a nationally representative survey, which is done at a certain time every year. So there was one wave of the survey in August of 2010. So this is the top left bullet over there. There was another wave of the survey done right after the households harvested that year, which was in 2011. Then the flood hits between 2012. And then I have sort of the post-planting part of the survey in wave 2, and then the post-harvest survey in wave 2. So there's basically 4 time periods that I'm able to look at the impacts. The thing that's a little tricky is that the third time period is actually exactly when the flood's hitting. So it makes it a bit challenging to look at step by step So for the main results, I'll just use the year before and the year after to look at the impacts. And the big part of this is that I do have information on the GPS coordinate of the household. It's not precise, so it's not like this person lives in this location, but it gives a general sense of this person lives within 5 kilometers of this GPS coordinate. So there's a little bit of error when it comes to that. Yes, question?
Yeah. Sorry, I'm interrupting.
No problem, please, yeah.
I'm from Nigeria.
Oh, fantastic.
Yeah, I'm so intrigued by this and I need to be here. But I have a question. September 2012 is harvest period, not necessarily post-planting. Yeah, so maybe you will need to look at that again.
Yeah,
Yeah, so August, September in Nigeria is harvest period. So post-planting is from February, March, April.
okay. Also, so I'm so glad you're here. Does this differ across like different parts of the country? Like, do some parts like harvest earlier than others, or is the cropping calendar
I
different?
will still have to ask you, where exactly did you use those case study area? Is it like southeastern Nigeria? Because I think that's where we had a flood. I'm from there.
Okay,
So, but I don't know if that's where your case study is.
so the case study is across the country? So,
No, I'm asking, I don't know your case study.
Yeah.
You studied Nigeria, but where specifically did you study?
so what I use is data from across the whole country. So there's, because there's some
Okay,
surveys.
basically, harvest period in Nigeria is August, September. You can check it on that.
Okay,
Yeah.
cool, thank you. So I think for this one, for the agricultural outcomes, I'll use just the February 2011 data and the February 2013 data. This is sort of in the survey itself. This is what they call the timings of each survey. So they call the 2011 data post-harvest, then the 2012 September data as post-planting. So I just use the definitions that are in the survey, but point taken that totally these things can be different. And as part of the survey, there's a lot of socioeconomic outcomes. There's agricultural practices. There's self-reported shocks as well, which I also use in the paper, and also food prices at the market. And since it's a panel survey, they interview the same people over time. The attrition rate is about 8.7%, which is pretty good in this context. And the surveyors make their best attempt to really track the households that did move. So this is the data that I use to sort of map the satellite. There's a product from NASA called MODIS, which provides images at a pretty low resolution. And the areas that have surface water are identified at 2-day intervals. And one of the problems with this type of data is that when there's clouds, there's rain, and the satellites can't see through the clouds. So that's why they try to use sort of 2-day intervals to capture this in the data. So this is South Nigeria, which the question was this coming from. And the areas that are in red were the ones that were flooded over the course of this time period. And I'll show the image for the entire country, but the flooding does tend to go close to the rivers. And the areas that are marked in red are the ones that are dictated as flooded as part of this data set. So there's 2 ways that I try to define flood exposure in the paper. And the first one is I ask people, and this is from the household survey itself. There is a question in the Alice Smith survey which asks, has your household been affected by a certain shock in the last 5 years? And there's about 21 different categories of shocks. And this is sort of the questionnaire that's provided for the individual. And the one that I use is category number 13, which says, were you flooded? And did that cause a harvest failure for you? So it's a very specific definition of flood, where someone could have been flooded, but didn't have a harvest failure. So that wouldn't be captured in this definition. So this is, so just keep that in mind as we go throughout the analysis. This just shows the distribution of households who report having a flood that caused a harvest failure across a number of years. And there is a pretty clear spike in 2012, where about 244 households, about 6 or 7% of the sample, do show a lot of self-reported flood in that year. And just to think about a couple limitations, I mentioned the fact that we don't really know what a harvest failure is. So this definition is sometimes a little bit sort of murky when it comes to understanding what it means. And the other one is that people could sort of say yes to this because they might think they might get support from either the person who's doing the survey or the government if they think that they're flooded. So these are a couple of caveats to keep in mind. The second option for trying to understand who's flooded is by taking the satellite data that was shown before with the approximate location of the household. And this is what this one looks like. Each of these red dots is basically the location of the household cluster. And there's about 8 households per cluster. So you can basically interpret this as we kind of know where the household lives, and it's around this area. And the blue is the aggregated flood area across the rainy season from July to November of that year. And I don't use anything on flood depth, it's just flood extent. So was this pixel flooded at any time during the course of the 4 months from the MODIS data? And this is what the data looks like. And it tends to sort of concentrate across the rivers, but there is some flooding in the north, which is shown as part of this sort of overlay of the two data sets. And because there is some uncertainty about the actual household location itself, I basically use a bunch of buffers to try to figure out sort of how close the household is to the flood. And in the main analysis, I'll use this sort of 5-kilometer buffer to identify which areas are flooded and which households are in those areas. The results are pretty robust to different definitions of flood exposure. And just also, I think it's important to mention a couple of limitations here. So one is a cloud cover issue when it comes to satellite. This type of images may also be less likely to detect small floods that are really important, like small flash floods. And the location of the household is approximate. It's not sort of exactly, 100% accurate on that.
Mook, you have a question?
Yeah.
Sir, quick question. Have you looked into the road? So I know, I do not really know this area exactly, but I'm thinking maybe sometimes the flood is overflow the road and that's once in a while in the inside area. But you think about adding some other, like, for example, road data into this.
So I have it, but I think it's a really good idea. So I think that it might be able to explain some of the results that I find. So I do find that food prices actually increase in areas affected by the flood. And it could be that there's really no ability for, transport to come in. So it's something that I can run. Thanks for the suggestion. Yeah.
Sorry, Mook, I also have a question about
Yeah.
flood exposure. So did it have to be certain prolonged exposure or is it flash flooding events? Because MODIS is daily resolution. So
Yeah.
just wondering how exactly for flood exposure, and I assume that not all the households were surveyed on the same day. Or,
Yeah.
I mean, did it have to say, were you exposed to flood over a week or, I mean, I know that question was pretty vague, but
Yeah.
if there was any sense of how long people might have been exposed.
Yeah. So I think that there's two points that you're bringing up. The first one is that for the MODIS, I classify as a pixel as being flooded if at any time during July to November that pixel had at least 1 day of flood.
Okay, I see.
So it's sort of like a very sort of generic representation of floods. On the second side, on the household side, they ask, were you flooded in a certain year? So
Okay.
2010, 2011, 2012. Again, not exactly what I want as a researcher, but it is sort of something to
So
understand
there could have been
the impacts.
mismatch in the household response versus what you were able to detect using the satellite data.
Yeah.
And then the satellite data, it sounds like it was a binary variables and not, I mean, because it would be interesting if you did code that as a continuous variable, because then you could see if there were more days where there were like some areas that had like more prolonged flooding, right?
Yeah.
Compared to other areas that only had like, you know, certain, like a few days that were flooded pixels.
Yeah, no, I think that's something that I could calculate. Thank you. Yeah. Hunter?
So I'm just curious why you decide on the 5 kilometer buffer. Is that reasonable given the size of the family plot for agricultural use? Or is that just better for returning results that appear similar to where your flood exposure is showing?
So the reason I chose 5 kilometers is that in the survey itself, they give like a GPS coordinate of the cluster of sort of that location. And then they offset that by 5 kilometers in the survey itself. So it could be anywhere in that 5 kilometer range where the household could live. I just decided to follow what was in the survey when deciding this. But I think it's something that I want to run also is like some sort of bootstrapping exercise where I can like randomly reallocate the household location across this 5 kilometer buffer and see sort of how robust the results can be to that.
That's really useful.
Yeah.
I think related to that, actually, then you could also run some kind of Monte Carlo simulation to tie that back to the flood exposure, because then you could have 2 variables where one is which day it is and then where's the location. So then you can see what is the distribution of exposure across different points across time.
Okay. Cool. No, thank you so much. Yeah. Okay, so this is what it looks like when I put both of the flood exposure metrics on the same map. And each of the dots represents what share of households in each cluster reported being flooded in that year. And the darker the red shows that more households report being flooded in the survey. And this just sort of like, you know, doesn't really, you know, when you look at it with the naked eye, it don't really look very similar. And even the correlations are pretty low, about 0.2 between the self-reported data and the satellite data, which is, I think for me, I would have expected a higher correlation before working on this, but this is sort of what I find. Yeah, go ahead.
I'm sorry, I'm trying to understand, so, because the one like unit from the paper side, the side of the, sorry, for the legend.
Yeah.
That is 3 kilometers, but it said, so within 5 kilometers, in the survey data, it's impossible to identify where the location is for the household. I wonder if that could lead to the lower correlation with the initiative.
So I try to get the most amount of households in the flood zone, because if I just try to overlay the cluster coordinate that I have in the data, like just like a point, like, you know, a random point with the flood data, there's about 38 households without the buffering. So as I increase the size of the buffer, I get more of these households to touch the flood area. So that's the one I get with the 394. And I think that when I run the correlation coefficient for each of these different categories, it's just like even lower when it comes to the 38 or the 102 or the 1 kilometer level, just because there's so much fewer observations of households actually inside of the flood zone. Am I answering your question, or am I?
Yeah, I kind of have a better understanding, so that's all, this is 3 kilometers, which is a large range comparing to the, like, the distance between the 2, like, cluster dots.
Yeah.
Is that 3 kilometers for the right figure and not for the entire country?
Yeah, this was just an example of like one particular point. And in these dots, it's just sort of a visual representation. Like this isn't like exactly the scale. Yeah, sorry about that. So I think the way that I think about this is that the survey data sort of asks the question, are you affected by the flood, while the satellite data is your area flooded, is your like surrounding area flooded. And that's sort of the way that I've been thinking about this in the paper. And this is just an aside. I spent a lot of time trying to understand all the different ways to measure floods in the literature. And a lot of papers use this thing called the Dartmouth Flood Observatory, which is some sort of product which also provides flood extents. And when it comes to this specific event, the Dartmouth flood extents are really big, and I don't really know how to interpret them. And I initially used the Dartmouth data in a previous incarnation of the paper until I realized that, for example, this polygon over here in the east of the country is the size of like Indiana and Illinois put together. So these are like really huge polygons, and a lot of people use this in the literature, but it really, for me, isn't the most precise way of estimating flood impacts. So that's why I decided to sort of take the MODIS instead of just the Dartmouth data. So on the, was there a question? No, okay, sorry. So on the outcomes, I look at agricultural outcomes and consumption outcomes. And one thing that I look at is crop production. So this looks at in the year of the harvest, how many kilograms did you harvest of maize, of all the different types of crops that you planted? And the second question is a question on crop revenue. So it asks the farmer, if you were able to sell all of your crops, how much money would you earn? So one of the outcomes is more of a quantity metric, kilograms of crop production. The other one is revenue. So how much money could you have earned if you sold all your product? And these are just a couple of descriptive statistics. For the average household, they get around 2,500 kilograms worth of crops every year, and they make around sort of 100,000 naira, which I think is close to a couple $400 or $500 back in 2012. But that's just sort of like the sort of range of outcomes. There's a couple of limitations here as well. Working with household survey data is very challenging. I found, especially in developing countries, where people report saying that they had 6 million kilograms of corn that was produced, and trying to sort of work with these outliers is a little challenging. So I sort of ran some sort of way to remove the impact of these outliers in the analysis, but this is still something that exists. As I mentioned before, different parts of the country harvest at different times. So if the flood sort of came before harvest in certain parts of the country, but came after the harvest in other parts of the country, that wouldn't have been able to sort of been into consideration in the analysis. I also don't look at livestock impacts. I'm planning on doing more work to look at livestock impacts in the future, but for now it's just crop when it comes to agricultural impacts. On consumption, I also am able to observe how much people spend when it comes to food and non-food and other types of durable goods every point of the survey. And these are just some figures on the sort of average consumption per person. It's around 80,000 naira, and it doesn't really seem to like, it sort of stays around that area across the sample. And a couple of limitations here is that this doesn't really capture asset damages. So let's say someone is affected by a flood and they end up selling their livestock. That way they can sort of maintain the same level of consumption. They can buy food and other things. That is sort of helpful in the short term, but can have very long-term implications where you lose your productive asset. So those types of impacts aren't really in this data. And the other one is that this is also self-reported. So we don't really observe how much people actually spend sort of on a day-to-day basis. So this is just a very standard empirical specification where I look at the impact of the flood on the agricultural outcome, either its production or value. And there's a bunch of control variables here as well, things like the age of the household head, whether they own a bank account, and other types of socioeconomic characteristics. But it's just a fairly simple before and after kind of equation where you look at the impact of the flood on a bunch of outcomes. On consumption, I do the same thing. I use more detailed data on the survey because data on consumption is collected at 4 points in time compared to just agriculture, which is just 2 points in time. But it's a very similar type of setup. So on the results, I'll first talk about agriculture. And I find that farmers who were flooded lost around 12 to 20% of total production on average, but there is heterogeneity based on each crop. And here in the next couple of slides, I'm just going to show some results. And each one of these rows is going to be a separate regression. They're not in the same framework. So I'll look at the impact of the flood represented through the survey first, and then represented by the satellite next. And for both metrics, it does seem like there is a significant drop in crop production by around 12 to 20%. But then when I disaggregate the results based on different types of crops like maize or sorghum or cassava or beans and so on, the results aren't so clear, where sometimes the two metrics seem to agree, sometimes they don't, sometimes the results aren't significant. And I'm still investigating sort of what the heterogeneity by crop actually means. I think it has to do a lot with the cropping calendar, where certain crops were harvested before others at certain parts of the country. So I'll be planning on looking at more detailed analysis on this as in the next part of the paper. Yeah.
And so in the survey from the World Bank, they actually asked which crops were affected. Okay.
Yeah. So basically, they have crop production for each specific crop. So they'll give you, say, 100 kilograms of maize, 200 kilograms of cassava, and so on. Yeah.
So I guess comparing the results from here against the summary table you showed just now, where basically between wave 1 and wave 2, the actual weight of crop actually increased. Does that mean that other non-flooded farmers kind of like made up for this lost production? Because on an aggregate level, the production actually still increased between wave 1 and wave 2, but we're finding that flooded farmers lost production. So how do we kind of reconcile these findings there?
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I think the short answer is there's a lot of other things that matter that aren't captured in this analysis. For example, like agricultural extension or different types of seed varieties. There's a lot of sort of stuff that goes on. I think floods are one part of the whole production equation, but there's definitely other things that aren't captured. So it's for sure a limitation. Yeah, so thanks. And one question, yeah.
Okay, I'm going to say that locations in Nigeria have specific crops to grow. And that is somehow affecting, I don't know, your analysis to me is not quite clear, because yam is known to the southeastern, while rice and meals, maize are known to the northern. So I am not getting a about this view. So there, the period of each of their flood impact. I think they should have specification of what they lost, what the farmers lost at that time. A farmer from the north should use a different thing from a farmer from the east. So I don't think to me, your analysis is not capturing that. And I am not, I think my problem now is because I'm from there and I understand it there. Or I have a picture that I'm expecting to see. Okay, so maybe you put that in mind. Okay.
Yeah. No, absolutely. So just to clarify, this looks at the impact for the same individual over time. So let's say there's a farmer in the Northeast. The results would compare what the farmer in the Northeast happened before the flood versus after the flood. So it would be able to sort of capture those impacts. But I definitely take your point the fact that it needs to,
I would love if we have a location to
Yeah.
describe each individual county.
okay,
Yeah.
sort of more like rerun this table for each different region of the country.
I think so, because I guess the 2012 flooding affected more around southeastern Nigeria.
Mhm.
But then I was in service in Benue State, that's North Central. We didn't experience any serious flooding, but those of them in southeastern Nigeria, it was huge.
Okay.
Some people moved into our village in southeastern Nigeria because their whole village was flooded.
Mhm.
Yeah, and they lost totally all their farm products. And you mentioned 12% to 20%. I don't know, maybe that's from the survey, but I think it's even bigger than that.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Cool.
So maybe you have to look into that metrics, whatever metrics you use to generate that number, that figure, you look into it. Yeah, I think it's more. It should be up to 40% to me.
Okay, yeah, no, cool, yeah, thanks a lot. I think that the issue is that when I restrict the sample a bit more, there's a lot less observations. So the standard errors get pretty big, but I definitely, I'll rerun
It was
this
a
with
beautiful
different.
study.
No,
I appreciate it.
Maybe, go ahead.
Do you have households moving between time periods?
Yeah,
And then do you actually observe like land area grown by household by crop?
Yeah.
Okay, so then are those factoring into these? Like the crop specific? So I guess you need the additional household controls because if you have people moving, then your fixed effect isn't getting location changes. But then decisions about what to grow and how much, are those in the crop specific regressions?
so those are not in the crop specific regressions. I do run a very similar type of thing where I look at the yield, where I take the crop production and divide it by the crop area for each crop, and the results are pretty similar. But that's as far as I've gone on that. Yeah,
I'm curious because there's a blended post-crop like the data.
Yeah.
I think based on my understanding of the presentation. I wonder during this period, so apart from the flood, is there any like other like natural factors or like a species, like other like factors that would affect the different plants and their yield?
I mean, I think there's like the fixed effects would capture for the changes for each household. I also do include time fixed effects to look at different types of things that might happen in a specific year. So unless there's something that sort of isn't captured by that, which could be in here, I think it's definitely a possibility, but at least based upon, so when I did this paper before, I included ways of the survey all the way up to 2018. So from 2012, 2015, 2018, but 6 years is a long time. And I think this is part of your point is that lots of other stuff can happen over that time period. That's why I tried to condense it as short as possible to look at sort of 1 year before and then 1 year after the flood. But definitely point taken, other stuff could be going on, sure. Cool. So this part of the analysis looks at crop revenue. So it looks at what the impacts were on households' ability to sort of make an income or a living from their crops. And here the results are different based on which metric you use to measure floods. So for the flood that was represented by the survey itself, there is actually a big drop in crop revenue by about 40,000, which is around 50%, which is really big in this context. But for households who are in the flood area based on the satellite data, there's actually almost no impact in the analysis. And this actually could be, related to the colleague's point over here, is that maybe the survey is just capturing people in the Southeast, for example, who are really affected by the flood and show these big impacts, while the satellite data is still be a little funky. There's a lot of uncertainty about the exact location, about the modus product, so that could be sort of a less accurate way of representing it. So that's one sort of explanation why these things are different. But let's say sort of this is what I found. I also want to split up sort of this sort of null result on the impacts of the flood on revenue into two categories. And the first category would be, what's the impact if you also are reporting to be flooded in the survey? So this would be for these sort of orange dots that are in the blue zone. What's the impact specifically for these individuals? And they're actually, I do sort of find a very similar estimate on the revenue for these individuals who they themselves report being flooded in the survey and also live in the flood area, do experience about a 50% drop in the value of their crop production. And then I look at the flip side of this argument, where what's the impact for this dot over here, who lives in the flood area, but they themselves were not affected by the flood based on the self-reported data. And the result here is the opposite, where I find that for these farmers, they actually report an increase in their crop revenue by about 20%. And one explanation for this is that if sort of I'm a farmer and I live in an area where all my neighbors were flooded, but I had some sort of defense to reduce the flood from coming onto my property, I might benefit from higher local food prices, given that there's a supply shock. And I do find some evidence that there is higher local food prices in flooded areas by about 35%. So it does sort of align with the story where there are higher food prices and some farmers benefit, some don't. But I think that, more important than the results here is that I really like looking at local level impacts, because you can really detect a lot more stuff that's going on, and you can learn more about the distribution of impacts across scale. One of the other questions that I want to look at was, do people who live in areas that historically were not flooded, but were flooded in 2012, do those people have sort of more impacts when it comes to agriculture? And in order to try to find an answer to this question, I was able to get a flood risk map for Nigeria from a company called Fathom, and they simulate flood depths for a sort of modeled flood. This model flood was a flood with a return period of 50 years, so one that happens every 50 years, which is very similar to the event in 2012. And using this map, I can look at which households live in areas which are pretty much flooded, given this data, and which ones were not in sort of this historical flood risk zone. And then I run the same results, and I split it into households that were inside the historical zone versus outside the historical zone. And I do find that households who were outside the historical zone, but were impacted in 2012, do have a larger drop in their crop production. And I find the same result for the revenue, where these households tend to lose a lot more. I think this is important from a climate change angle, because with climate change, a lot of people who weren't affected before are going to be affected in the future. And these people are probably less well adapted to floods or storms or droughts. So trying to understand these differential impacts, I think, is really important. And I think it's part of sort of the reason why I want to look at this question. And now I'm almost done with the results, and I'll talk about consumption. This is something that I want to look at because I found in the literature that people do report spending less money after they're hit by a flood or a storm. But I don't find a lot of impacts here using either way of representing the flood, or I look at lagged effects. So what's the impact on consumption the year after? There's really nothing much that's going on in the data here. There's a lot that sort of households do in response to floods, but it wasn't able to be captured with the data on consumption that I have in this context. I do split it up into urban and rural households, and I do find some evidence that households that are in urban areas do reduce the food consumption the year after, but the results are pretty different based on which metric I use to represent flood. So I think there's a lot of uncertainty here about what's actually going on. So there's a bunch of limitations of the study, which many of you have already pointed out. There's a lack of precision on the flood measurement and the household location. I can't always capture flooding that didn't cause harvest failure, but was still a flood. There's lots of stuff going on when it comes to agricultural impacts beyond just floods, which aren't captured in this analysis. The sort of consumption smoothing that I find where households maintain the same level of consumption could hide a lot of sort of stress that the family has. Do they take their children out of school? Do they reduce expenditures on health? Do they sell their assets? These are all open questions that are really important. And also there's a lot less data on what farmers did to protect their own plots from from floods. And these things are really important to understand sort of how people protect their own land from floods. I think that one thing that I'm really interested in is looking at how these results might inform some sort of policy. And when I was reading articles about disaster risk management in Nigeria, one specialist called it to clapping with one hand, which I think he was trying to say that basically there's no DRM policy in Nigeria. There's not a lot of support from the government to people who are affected. So I think there's a lot that sort of could be done, which currently isn't being done. From the survey, I found that about 90% of households who were flooded sort of were just on their own. They didn't get any support from the government. Only about 4% of households had safety nets. There were some policy documents which showed that aid was distributed to households, but the overall figure was about 1% of total losses. So there's a lot of sort of room for different things that policymakers could do. I think I wanted to more think of like what sort of form can future policy take to support the poorest? Is it that you give people money? Is this sort of an option? Is it to try to stabilize local food prices? Is this sort of a better, more feasible option? Could you think about grain storages? And for example, this is just a map about where different grain storage facilities are across the country. And it could be nice to look at whether or not the grain storage areas themselves are prone to flooding, and combining with the suggestion on roads. Is it sort of more difficult to get grain to areas that are affected when it comes to floods? There's a lot that could sort of be done from a spatial planning perspective as to where we store grains and how can we help people after a flood. The other thing that I think is pretty important is that, you know, the results are very different for the survey-based indicator and the satellite-based indicator. And if we want to sort of design products like index insurance, which are products where, let's say, it floods or you get hit by a storm, you get paid a certain amount of money. I think it's important we figure out how we actually measure sort of, is there a flood or is there a storm? Do we ask people? Do we look at satellites? Do we do both? I think it's really important to sort of understand the measurement aspect of this. Just to summarize, so farmers affected by this flood lost about 20% of crop production and 40% of revenue, but the impacts were not evenly distributed. It really depends on if you're affected and your neighbors are affected, and also looking at local price changes as well. Just a couple of things on future research. So I mentioned before, the 2022 floods were just, you know, as bad as 2012, even worse. And there's a couple of things that I'm planning on doing in the future. And we got money to do some field work in Nigeria, which we're currently planning right now with colleagues at Berkeley and in Zurich and in Ireland. There's two things that we want to look at specifically is that can households change the types of crops that they plant to make them more flood resistant, or to change the seed varieties? And the other one is looking at labor reallocation. So can households sort of move to urban areas? Is this something that is helpful? Do they benefit from these changes if, say, there's less work on the farm? We're also looking at mental health impacts of floods, because typically what happens if villages are totally flooded, they have to move somewhere, they might go to the nearby town or a government camp. They might stay there for a number of months, and the conditions can be very bad in those areas. So how does this affect their ability to think about the future and to plan for a sort of more evolving and uncertain climate when it comes to floods and shocks? And we're also looking at early warning communication. So how do people receive alerts about floods? Do they relate to this in a way that is helpful, or can sort of we improve the communication? And also, a lot of these flood impacts are made worse by dam releases, especially from Cameroon and from other parts of the country. So we're also trying to learn how people decide to release water from dams and how this affects downstream households. That's basically it for me. Thanks for all your comments and your questions, and I really enjoyed it. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Thank you. That was excellent. And unfortunately, we're out of time, but if folks want to stick around, you have some time to
Yeah,
stick around
yeah,
and chat
absolutely,
with
yeah.
people.
Yeah.
So yeah, feel free to stick around. I do have an announcement. We have another seminar on Tuesday, and Natalie, where's
And Phillips,
in Phillips Hall, which room?
328.
328. So we have Associate Professor Paul O'Keefe from Yale NUS College in Singapore, where I used to work, where GE is an alum, coming to talk about, what is the topic?
So the title of the talk is why you can tell students,
To follow their passions, yes. So I think of broad interest to all of us as students and educators. So he does really, he's a psychologist, but he also is based at the business school at National University of Singapore. And so he does a lot of work on mindsets and motivations. And if you heard of this famous phrase of like being in a growth mindset, he works with a Stanford professor. He was in that lab doing his postdoc. So he does a really interesting work. It's different from environment, but I think is like broadly appealing, and he's a good friend. So hopefully you can make it next Tuesday, 12:30, Phillips Hall, room
328.
328.
Sending out flyers.
Yes, but thank you so much, Mook. That was
Sure.
really interesting. And I think you have a lot of folks who want to stay after and chat with you. So thank
Yeah,
you.
awesome.
Thanks.
Thanks, Angel.